Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Future of Sports Policy conversation. I'm Ashley Huffman, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Aspen Institute, and I'm thrilled to be here with so many leaders, innovators, and advocates who care deeply about the future of sport in America. Let's just start with a simple truth. The U.S. sports system is at an inflection point. From NIL to private equity, from high school fields and sports teams to Olympic podiums, every layer of our sports ecosystem is shifting. College athletes are becoming entrepreneurs. Youth sports are becoming more privatized, exclusive, and expensive. And the Olympic and Paralympic pipelines are being reimagined in real time. Yet all of this transformation is happening without a national playbook. We're one of the only developed nations in the world without a coordinated sports policy, no federal department, no guiding vision for how sports serves the public good. So while Congress debates college sports reform, few are asking how those decisions ripple down to youth athletes. And while efforts are made to protect Olympic sports, we're not always asking how to recruit and retain the next generation of athletes to keep that pipeline strong. That's why today's conversation matters. Policy isn't just paperwork or politics, it's the set of values we choose to protect through law, investment, and leadership. And if we get it right, sport can be one of the most powerful tools we have to strengthen communities, improve health, and inspire belonging. And we want you to be part of that conversation. As we move along through this, please drop your questions in the chat so that we can answer those at the end of this panel. So before we jump into our panel, I want to set the stage for two leaders who have really been shaping this conversation for years. First, Tom Ferry, Executive Director and founder of Aspen Institute's Sport and Society program, whose work has led a national movement to make sport accessible and accountable to all kids, not just the privileged few. Tom has been one of the most important voices on what it means to build a smarter, more equitable sports system. And joining him is Dion Kohler, professor of law at the University of Baltimore and the author of More Than Play, How Law, Policy, and Politics Shape American Youth Sports. Dion's research illuminates the legal and political structures, often invisible to the public, that determine who gets to play, who gets protected, and who gets left behind. Together, Tom and Dion will help us understand how we got here and what it will take to ensure that the golden decade ahead, from the 26th World Cup to the LA 28 Games, leaves not just a medal legacy, but a policy legacy that benefits everyone. Tom, Dion, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, Ash. Really appreciate it. All right. So listen, there are sports policy experts, and then there's Dion Kohler, who is fluent not just in Title IX and college sports law, which have dominated the discourse in recent years, but policy and law that shapes the largest and most important layer of our sport ecosystem, the foundation upon which everything else sits, which is youth sports. Her new book, More Than Play, is a must read for anyone who seeks to understand the environment that shapes the experience of the more than 30 million American youth who participate in sports. She's also deeply studied the Olympic and Paralympic movement in this country and the policies that created the conditions for serial abusers like former USA Gymnastics Dr. Larry Nassar to go unchecked for years. She was chair of the Olympic Reform Commission that created by Congress that produced a 277-page report and a bold set of recommendations in 2023. So she is the perfect person to start off this conversation. Welcome, Dion.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
So glad you're here. My first question for you, it really is foundational. It might seem obvious to experts, but one that maybe isn't top of mind for those who just see sports as entertainment. And that is, why does sports policy matter in this country, and in which ways? And maybe you can give me an example or two that where a policy has shaped significantly the sport experience in ways that are maybe not obvious to fans.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, Tom, we know that policy matters in society generally. I think we very often forget that, and we focus a lot on kind of wrong-headed policy or policy failures. But we really forget that there are so many examples of very successful public policy. So policy isn't a bad word, and policy certainly hasn't been a bad word in American sports. If you look at the development of American sports, the Ted Stevens Act in direct response to the perception that we were not living up to our potential in international Olympic competition, collective bargaining as a policy tool in professional sports, and of course Title IX, one of the most successful policy interventions ever. So policy has made a huge difference in society, and it has definitely made a huge difference in American sports.
Absolutely. How would you characterize U.S. sports policy? In terms of, I guess, its coherence. Does it make sense? Do all the pieces fit together in the right way?
Yeah, no, they don't. And that was one of the challenges in writing this book was how do I make sense of all of this? And it is hard to make sense of. So you can characterize it, I think, as context-driven, reactive, uneven, inconsistent. On the one hand, there's this very strong notion that the government should stay out of sports. And on the other hand, there's this very strong inclination, and we know we're seeing it now, from sports sponsors or sports leagues to ask for government help. Like the NCAA coming to Congress saying, please intervene, we want an antitrust exemption. So it's this both stay out of sports and put sports on policy agendas that creates this inconsistency.
Mm-hmm. And why is it so disjointed? Is it just these competing ideas in our society around, libertarianism and free markets? And I mean, why is it particularly disjointed in the sports space, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. I think as American sports has developed, we haven't always sort of taken sports seriously, so to speak. But very often our sports policy has sort of popped up in a reactive way in response to a particular problem. So as Ashley said at the outset, without any kind of government agency or coordinating body that has real expertise in sports, kind of studying issues responsive to Congress, setting goals, providing targeted funding, sport has been left to the private sector, just open it up to develop at all levels. So we have professional sports that are treated by law and policy as kind of businesses with the same workplace laws that apply there. Then we have the more reactionary policymaking, right? The Ted Stevens Act in response to underperformance in international Olympic competition. College sports developing under a totally different umbrella, under the kind of educational umbrella, now running as a business, and so laws of general applicability have caught up. So we have this sort of hit and miss approach, and without anybody sort of trying to coordinate, this is what we got.
In theory, policy is meant to serve the public, citizens, including those at the base, some of the most marginalized folks out there, not just the powerful. When you look at sport policy in this country, who are the most marginalized voices, those who are really not represented well and served well through policy?
Well, I think without a doubt it's children. And that's because, sort of by design, right? Parents' rights are strong. Children don't really have rights in this country. We're the only country that is not signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So children's voices are not part of the conversation. That's not unusual for the United States, but what that means is without any national policy, without any federal government agency, and of course we have states, we have a federalist system, national and state sort of sharing power. States have done relatively little. This would be an area where you would expect states to do a lot. They do a lot for kids, recognizing that kids are in a vulnerable position in so many other areas, not so with sports. And so this has been left to the parents and the private sector to kind of create haphazardly, without any coordination, what youth sports is. And so what's really happened is, as you know better than anybody, Tom, and your research is showing through all over my book, it's expensive. The experience is not always as ideal as we assume that it is. And too many kids can't play. And Tom, the ones even that can't play, we have too many kids who aren't interested in playing. And I'm always stunned as the years have gone by, as I've taught sports law, and I talk to my classes, how many say, no way, I didn't want to play. It was way too intense or way too this. So that's what we've got.
Mm-hmm. You were the chair of the Olympic Reform Commission, shorthand. And you did sort of look at the entirety of the ecosystem. You didn't just keep, evaluate the experience of elite athletes. You tried to look at the pipeline as well. What did you conclude? What reforms are needed based upon your research?
Well, I mean, a few things. So Congress charged our commission with studying 10 areas. I'm really proud of the bipartisan consensus report that we delivered. I learned a whole lot of things from that, but a couple really stick out. First of all was that all our surveys, our opinion polling, our deep research, a lot of which, Aspen Institute helped, but we did a lot of independent polling and that kind of thing. And what we found is absolutely the American public supports paying for and supporting youth sports. This is not public support. Public funding is not a bad word to the American public when it comes to finding ways for more kids to participate in sports. Second thing is that as we work through the kind of history of sports development, how did we get here in this country? It became clear that the U.S. Sports ecosystem has developed at all levels to such an extent that we really must bring public policy into the conversation. Being reactive is not enough. We can do better. We can lead the world. And so those were the two findings that really stuck out to me.
So what needs to happen now, Dion, in this moment of great disruption, right? We've got technology streaming technology capturing every moment that a child plays sports from the moment they slip on a uniform, right? We've got private equity entering the space. We've got NIL coming down the pipeline. We have White House executive orders, all reshaping the delivery and the regulation of sport experiences down to the entry level, but not only at the entry level, really the whole ecosystem is being challenged from a number of different angles. What needs to happen now in this moment?
Yeah, so it's really time to move from discussion to real action, Tom. I think we can get caught up in details, and there are always little details. We're looking at a lot of trees, and I think we're missing the forest. The problems with youth sport, big picture, that we are talking about today are problems that are not at all new. We've been talking about these since the progressive era. They're getting worse. Very little changes, and we just keep having the same conversations. So it's a kind of market failure in a way. And so I think we forget that at federal, state, and local levels, we can do more and work to put smart policy into youth sports, and we should. So what it means is it's time to stop assuming that simply urging kids to play sports is enough of a sports policy. Just saying, go out there, go play sports, kids, that's not going to do it anymore. I believe we need to view youth sports the way we viewed issues with, for instance, securities markets in the early 20th century. Bring all the stakeholders together, not to micromanage, not to regulate providers out of business, but to set goals, adopt common sense reforms that everybody can agree on, create options and models that are financially sustainable and supported with sort of targeted government funding at all levels. We need to work with industry to adopt these reforms, again, just the way that we've done in other successful models in U.S. history. And the way we do that, I believe, is to anchor sports policy in the well-being of children by recognizing that children have certain rights or should have certain rights in sports and building out from there.
The good news is you're not alone in that. We've the Children's Bill of Rights in Sports, which you helped us draft. The Institute
I'm a believer, Tom. Yes.
Has been endorsed by more than 500 entities, most NGBs, the Olympic Committee, dozens of mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. There is a good amount of consensus. We've actually been surprised at how little pushback we've gotten on this idea that every kid should have a right to play sports and when in the care of adults, health, safety, voice, fun, all matter. That's great. All right. So now, the big talk in Capitol Hill here is college sports reform. I mean, the push for an antitrust exemption. It's been hard and heavy. It's been going on for years now. We'll see if something actually gets, passed. But what's interesting is that whole conversation has only been talk about how to fix that piece of the puzzle, which is the college piece. But we know that college sports sits within a larger ecosystem. Whatever gets introduced at that level will absolutely have an impact on high school and youth sports, and will probably have some impact on Olympic sports and maybe women's sports. I don't know. So how do we should we like be designing for the full ecosystem in mind? I mean, or where do you see the hazard in just designing for college at this time?
Well, I think we know, and history shows us what the hazard is when we have the siloed thinking, Tom, right? And our commission report talked about this quite a lot. Safe sport is a great example, right? You have an innovation that applies in the Olympic and Paralympic movement space, and then guess what? The right hand isn't talking to the left hand, and you can have abusers go from this context to that context to that context, and we're not sharing and thinking about all the other sports contexts. And so what I talk about in the book, what I try to do is say youth sport connects to it all, right? We have to, anytime we do sports reform in this country, we have to have that full ecosystem in mind. Youth sport, of course, can be an end in itself, and for most children, we know it is. But the reality is that youth sport, and again, it was in the commission report, and I talked about it in the book, it connects to all other levels of sport. We have to keep that in mind. So we know that not all children will grow from grassroots youth sports into college or pro or Olympic or Paralympic athletes. But every person who emerges in these settings started in youth sports. So youth sports, I believe, must have a seat at every sports policy table.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Tion. Listen, stick around for the audience Q&A at the end of the hour. If folks have questions, please share it in the Q&A function. But now let me bring back Ashley, who will moderate our next panel, a terrific group of original thinkers who no doubt will pump a few big ideas into the bloodstream. Ash, over to you.
All right, that was so good. Thank you, Dion and Tom. Thanks for setting the stage to help us see not just how we got here, but why this moment is so consequential, legally, politically, and culturally. We want to bring in a group of amazing people, as Tom said, across law, lobbying, investment, athlete development, to talk about what comes next. So please help me welcome our panelists. We have Binta Nyambi Brown, entertainment partner at Manat, Phelps and Phillips, LLP. We have Stephen Weiler, Government Relations Director in Invariant. We have Jared Cooper, Executive Director, Fund Play Foundation, and Brent Richard, CEO, IMG Academy. So you all have heard the discussion, and you have so much expertise and different lenses in which to see this. I'll ask a couple of opening questions for all of you to answer. And Stephen, I'm going to start with you because you're on Capitol Hill. We often say the U.S. has no national sports policy, yet we have an entire ecosystem built on sport. Why does this matter now? What's at stake if we continue operating without a coordinated framework? So I'll kick it to you first, Steve.
Sure, and happy to be here. Sports policy is a passion area of mine as a former college football player, a kicker, so football loosely. I would not be the person I am or the lobbyist I am without sports. I think the answer is if we don't use the mega decade now to address a lot of the challenge that we see, we're going to risk going down the same path with a lot of the challenges that Tom and Diane just mentioned and identified. As I see it, personally speaking, the conversations right now are being dominated by college sports, professional sports, for good reason. There's attention on Capitol Hill. There's attention from members of Congress, the Trump administration, to getting it right. But I think the missing piece of this conversation is children and youth athletics. And if we don't identify the problems there, we're going to continue down the rate of 53% of participation needs to improve. We're going to continue to see stories like Diane identified, which are the health risks, the safety risks. So I think the challenge that I see is if we don't take advantage of the what we have in front of us now with the big sports coming, we're not going to improve those numbers. We're not going to improve the foundations that ultimately help college sports, professional sports, and help the United States be the dominant force we are in the sports ecosystem.
Great, Steve. Thank you. And Brent, I'll kick to you next because you're working in that elite development space. What happens if we keep operating without a framework?
Well, yeah, thanks, Ashley. So, first of all, I'd say I'm a little more of a pragmatist, and I don't think the ideas of youth sports ecosystem and college sports are mutually exclusive. What I do think is that there's an opportunity right now in college sports, and we should take that opportunity and take some action. And for me, that actually means not the 2 or 3% of college athletes in a few sports in 50 to 100 schools. It's important to get that model right. But as the rules are being rewritten for that reality, you have almost 500,000 other student athletes. And so when I go around the world, I've been around the world on youth sports and elite pathways and broader pathways. The most unique and differentiated thing everybody wants to talk about our system is college sports. And they don't mean it in the context of it being an entertainment property for a few sports. They mean it as, first of all, it's incredibly hard to replicate. It is a developmental pathway. 75% of every Team USA athlete in the Olympics was a varsity college athlete. And what other nations I've seen, I think it's a national treasure, have not figured out is how to also make it great education. You can create elite developmental pathways to try to find one kid out of 100, but what happens to the other 99? We actually have a system here that works really, really well in creating great humans contribute to the workforce. So at the same time, right now, what's happening to women's and Olympic sports is we've seen thousands of roster spots cut. That is the reality that's happening right now around the country. And I think there's two, it's really simple from my perspective, and you can actually do something about it. The first one is do no harm. Let's just start there. Like, it's not hard as we're rewriting these rules because it turns out that some college sports is good at entertaining adults, which is the reality. Like, do no harm to everybody else. So let's just start there. The second, more specific recommendation is we can take a very simple, positive step. And it just requires a slightly different mental framework. The first is there's 8 million high school student athletes being crammed into 500,000 college roster spots. That supply-demand imbalance is really tough, and it creates all kinds of downstream impacts into youth sports that we talk about today. We should have 1 million college roster spots for serious sports in college. Let's start with that opportunity. There is demand. I am sure that there is demand. There is not supply. What is the one thing standing in the way of supply? The NCAA could solve it. Universities themselves could solve it, or Congress could solve it as a part of their various bills in Congress, is that college operates on a generations old idea that one team equals one sport, or oftentimes one team equals one field. That model is doesn't exist in youth sports. Walk into any sports field in America, and what you will find in youth sports, you will find multiple teams, you will find multiple levels of play. And yet when they get to college, we've got a system that says only serious sports are one team, one sport. So that's bad for parents. It's not what they want. It's bad for kids. Honestly, it's bad for coaches who want developmental pipelines in college sports. And it's not good for donors and taxpayers that fund a lot of these, fields. So for me, 1 million athletes in this golden decade we're talking about is achievable. One change is required, is that we need to be able to have universities make good, economically sound decisions to be able to run multiple teams in a single sport, period. There's some wrinkles to it, but mostly it's that easy. And you don't need to force universities to do anything. You just open up the ability to compete on participation, and I think we'd see 1 million athletes in the next decade.
Incredible. Thank you, Brent. Benta, over to you. Thinking about it from the entertainment side, what happens if we continue operating without a framework? And what do you think are some of those blind spots that maybe we're not thinking about? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
the first rule is to learn how to Zoom in 2025, right? Um, so from an entertainment lens, I'm really looking at it from the perspective of competitiveness, right? And the reality is that particularly as certain of the pro leagues are expanding globally, and even if the pro leagues weren't expanding globally, the reality is that many nations around the world are catching up to where we've been. I think that there's a really good example with the intentionality that went behind testing and building out women's, the WNBA, but also the focus on women's basketball for the 1996 Olympics and building up that team. How long can we stay dominant? I mean, we've been dominant for a long time, but how long can we stay dominant in the absence of a cohesive policy? Like how long can we stay dominant in some of the other Olympic sports in the absence of a cohesive policy, particularly as other nations around the world are making certain investments, prioritizing. The money is not just coming from the US anymore. There are other countries that are putting extraordinary amounts of, like real dollars into their sports. And it's because, as you say, Ashley, like people recognize that on the one hand, this is very much about, the joy that comes from play, but it's also about the entertainment value, right? And there's another aspect of this as well, again, from an entertainment lens, which is that part of the reason why I think that we continue to love and to cherish sports is because it's one of the last few places, music doesn't do this anymore, film and television don't do this anymore. Sport is one of the last few places that has the capacity to bring, like vast, large numbers of people together who have different backgrounds, different experiences, but they're all coming after a common cause, right? When you're sitting in that stadium, when you're sitting in that arena, there's a particular feeling that comes over you, right? Like you're there for your team. And sometimes you might be there for your team, but you can really appreciate when the other team has an extraordinary performance, right? So from the perspective of competitiveness, of wanting to stay on top, of wanting to continue to have the entertainment value, and from a business perspective, with all of the different ancillary properties that are building up around sport, right? It's always been the case, or not always, but it's been the case for some time that, or at least historically, what we export in terms of entertainment has been one of our greatest exports. But now we're starting to fall behind because we haven't been intentional in the same way. This is, by the way, to take nothing away from the importance of protecting young people, making sure that they're safe, making sure that they're healthy. I think that all of that plays into this as well, because if you only focus on the money or the dollars or the entertainment value, but you're not focusing first off on the human being, then that's the other way that this gets destroyed. But from my perspective, it's genuinely about competitiveness. It's about American competitiveness. It's how we can continue to stay dominant in ways that allow the entire franchise to expand, and being really thoughtful and intentional about what that looks like in the years to come.
I think it's a beautiful point, especially in today's climate. When you think about feeling unified through diversity and, breaking down barriers of polarization, I think that's a really important point, Binta. So speaking of all of that, Jared, you're in that funding space and legislation and advocacy space. So from your seat, where do you see some of the blind spots about how our system currently functions, and what do you think a coordinated framework could do for us?
Yeah, thanks, Ash. I think, you asked what's at stake if we continue operating without a coordinated framework. And I think what's at stake is that too many kids are left on the sidelines. And what Aspen Institute has done a really great job of over the last decade plus is sharing information and data, such as the Active Youth Do Better in Life graphic and so many other things like that, that show that kids that participate in youth sports have better outcomes. And that carries through early childhood, through adolescence, and into adulthood. But unfortunately, the benefits of participation don't accrue to those who are unable to play. And the number one barrier is cost. So we need to support organizations that are providing opportunities to kids, that are properly training coaches, that are providing the proper child safeguarding and background checks, encouraging the right type of behavior from coaches and parents and towards officials. And so that's what Fun Play does. That's where the types of organizations that we're supporting. And we think there's opportunities to do this through the right policy and legislation. And that kind of ties to the blind spots that you're asking about. From my perspective, I think the biggest blind spot is in how sports are perceived. That, I mean, Dion's book is called More Than Play. That sports participation, it leads to better educational outcomes, better physical and mental health outcomes, fewer interactions with the juvenile justice system. Kids who play are less socially isolated. They're on their screens less. They're less anxious, less likely to do self-harm. And so when you think about all the societal challenges that we're facing, that every elected lawmaker across the country is dealing with across their district and the constituents of their district are dealing with, youth sports is and can be a positive intervention towards those challenges. So I think that lawmakers need to be thinking about youth sports as more than just play, and as youth enrichment and youth development. And so that's what we're trying to do, to educate elected officials when we meet with them, to bring constituent organizations to their elected leaders, to educate them on how sports should be treated as a must in their communities, as opposed to something that's just fun and a nice to have. So that's kind of the blind spot that I see in terms of not only the way that sport is functioning, but how it's perceived.
Yeah, I think, such a great school for life. And so where do we learn those things if we aren't offering that opportunity to folks? So I think you brought up a lot of great points around the things that sport with intentionality can solve. So I kick it to Steve again. Are you seeing any bipartisan interest around specific areas? Jared mentioned a few. We talked about mental health, safety, infrastructure. Is there anywhere in this current climate where we see maybe both sides are ready to collaborate or come to the table around specific things? Obviously, super important moment. And as Jared mentioned, a solve to so many of today's biggest challenges. So just curious where you're seeing alignment.
Hopefully, I'm not telling any secrets or not going to get any policymaker in trouble, but yes, absolutely. I see bipartisanship in Washington every single day. And I know that may sound silly when we're staring down a government shutdown right now. And that's not to say there aren't very significant and different policy differences that policymakers have in Washington. But yes, I can give you a very real and very timely story on that. I'm working on several bills to introduce on behalf of several clients. And I can tell you that every single office has said, do you have a Republican? Do you have a Democrat? And that is the order I've been given. So I see it daily, and that is definitely the instruction. We still have very serious policymakers and people who want to do well for the American public in Washington. So absolutely yes. I was with several staffers this morning, and they were talking about how they're really excited for the shutdown to hopefully end here soon, because they have a lot of policies they're working on, bipartisan policies they're working on that will be bipartisan hearings, bipartisan markups. So yes. To answer more specifically, so most of my clients are in the preventative health tech space, and I see bipartisanship every single day in those areas. So preventative health, for example, I think there is a real recognition that chronic disease is skyrocketing across the country. Both sides might have different ways to address that, but that is a fundamental recognition that, physical health plays a massive role in that. So that's one area. Telehealth is another example in the health tech space. Even in sports, as a lot of the people on this call have talked about, college sports is dominating the conversation on Capitol Hill. But if you look at the competing acts right now, the score and safe, for example, there are even places of bipartisan commonality in those specific bills. Areas that come to mind are athlete mental health, athlete safety, coaching standards. So even in the competing sports policy bills, we're seeing bipartisanship. But I do think Diane made a really good point that the American public overwhelmingly supports youth sports. Those are stats that policymakers will watch. There is not a more sympathetic group of people than kids. So how can we tell that story to policymakers on Capitol Hill? Every single one of them, I can guarantee you, has some connectivity to youth sports, whether they played, their kids played, their grandkids played. So you already are at an advantage when you bring an issue that they have familiarity with. And within those areas, I can promise those kids or grandkids are talking about, hey, I love my coach. My coach is doing these things right. Or I need these protections. So within the craziness that is Washington, yes, there is bipartisanship. Yes, there's bipartisanship on sports policy. And even more specifically, I think youth sports is one that we are absolutely primed to see significant bipartisan support. Jared and the folks on this call have done a tremendous job working with the Youth Sports Caucus. That's a bipartisan caucus. There are several youth sports bills pending where it's a Republican and a Democrat. These are issues that we know Americans care about, so we know that the policymakers will absolutely want to drive meaningful bipartisan change.
I appreciate that, Steve. I know it's a wild world out there, but I want to talk about a policy that has really shaped my own life and I think radically transformed the landscape, especially for women and girls. So, Binta, I want to come to you. I want to talk about Title IX as a college basketball player, near and dear to me. And when I think about the future of college sports and where we think about college athletes becoming maybe employees, what does that mean for Title IX and gender equity? How do you see, from a legal and policy standpoint, this shifting the landscape yet again, specifically for women and girls?
Sure. So before I answer that question, which I think is a really important conversation to have, especially post-House, where people have started paying attention to Title IX in a different way, given some of the appeals to the House settlement. I want to actually go back to your initial question, because there was one other point that I'd like to make in terms of the blind spots. And in some ways, this plays into the Title IX conversation, right? Which is that we are in an environment where there's increasingly privatization of public spaces. That privatization of public spaces means that there are less places around, particularly for lower income and otherwise disadvantaged young people, and even adults, amateur adults, to go and to play and to be outside and to be with one another. The barriers and the cost of participating in sport at all levels are increasing. They're becoming higher and higher and higher. So again, like in terms of the blind spots, we are potentially missing both the discovery of new talent as well as the investment in new talent. If we only look for talent in one place, like meaning the people who have access to, particular fields and courts and places of play and training, then we're losing a lot, right? And so that goes both to the competitiveness, but it also goes to the health of our society and all of the ancillary benefits that come off from investing in sport and youth sport. So, getting to your question about what happens, as if college students or student athletes are considered employees, and what is the impact of Title IX? The first question, or the gating question there, is whether or not student athletes are likely to become employees. I think a year ago, a lot of us thought that it was reasonable to expect that this would happen relatively quickly. But a lot has changed in the past year, right? The movement towards college students becoming employees has been thwarted. The current administration withdrew the 2021 memo that suggested that college students could be considered employees. The NLRB is led by somebody who is not necessarily as enthusiastic about the idea of collective bargaining for college students, which is an important part of that question of college students becoming employees. And the recent movements, I think, particularly as concerns Dartmouth College, like there seems to just have been a lot of slowdown in that space. But even if college students become employees, your question of, well, what happens under Title IX? My view is that Title IX still applies, right? It should not, it should not go away. Like it is there to protect against sex discrimination. It applies to all members of the campus community. The guidelines that used to be up on the Department of Education's site, but are no longer there, given politics, but also given the shutdown. The guidelines that used to be up on the site made it pretty clear that all aspects of this are covered. It's inconceivable to me that we would treat medical residents different from student athletes, that we would treat people who are on work study different from student athletes, that we would treat any of the other groups of employees who are on campus and in the campus setting any differently from student athletes. So I think that Title IX still applies in that context. The next question becomes if it's a third party, right? So for example, if it's coming from an NIL collective, if it's coming from some other third party, is there still protection? My view is that there is still protection and that there ought to be protection, again, coming from the guidelines that used to be up on the Department of Education. So for anybody who's not aware, the Department of Education enforces Title IX through its Office of Civil Rights. And I'm going to get to in a second what the biggest challenge is. It's not necessarily students becoming employees. It's the political environment we're in and the complete gutting of the Office of Civil Rights. And I'll talk about Title VII very briefly in just a quick second. So the guidelines and the guidance that used to be up made it pretty clear that it remains the case that funds that are provided by a private source do not relieve a school of its responsibility to treat all student athletes in a non-discriminatory manner. So the basic protections, I think, are safe and should be there. We'll see how this all plays out. If for some reason you could say that Title IX doesn't apply, Title VII should apply, right? Like Title VII is the other legislation that applies to equal pay, right? So should apply. But again, the biggest issues, once we get through all of this analysis and conversation, is that the Department of Education has been gutted. Many of those jobs, or some of those jobs in the Office of Civil Rights, came back in August after a recent ruling, but now we're in the shutdown, and the Secretary of Education has been saying, I think she said yesterday on television or a couple of days ago, see, it works out just fine without Department of Education. So who would actually enforce Title IX? That's unclear to me. That's something that we're going to have to work out.
Really appreciate that insight. I think, policy, people hear that word, they're either scared or confused. Policy reflects priority and it reflects protections. And so I think this is why it's a really important conversation to have. There are so many good questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we save time for those. But I do want to ask Brent and Jared two questions because we did talk about privatization of the public good. And I think that, Brent, I would love to just ask you, you sit at the IMG space, it sits at the elite development level. How do we incentivize the private sector, whether it be sponsors or leagues or investors, to really align youth and elite pathways rather than fragment, which is what we're seeing?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. So I would just say a couple things related to this. On Stephen's point, it should be bipartisan. The catalyst here is 30,000 student athletes in college that are now making serious money. There's 500,000 that aren't, as we think about college sports. There's 75 million youth sports parents and their kids. So if you're in politics and you think about youth sports as a constituency, 60% of every college kid played sports in high school. There's a huge constituency. So there's opportunities to win. And the second thing I'd say is there is outside private funding available, but I would not assume, I saw some questions in the chat that I can just hit now, that universities themselves, mostly nonprofit, cannot figure out how to get to 1 million college student athletes. If you haven't found out, I'm interested in that particular outcome, and I think that would be great for youth sports. If it wasn't profitable, D3, D2, lower level D1 wouldn't exist. It's called tuition-driven enrollment. Every university has tuition-paying students and aid. The lever that universities do not have is to allow student athletes, through participation, to self-fund. More scholarships for student athletes that otherwise can't afford to be in those schools. So you have to create an opportunity for universities to self-fund. The economic model is there. for universities, you don't have to force them to do anything. Some may not believe it, others will. Let them go figure it out. But I think what we'll find is that universities see that they can self-fund. If I were to pick one other funding source from the private sector, I would say that brands, the companies that are selling goods, gear, could be bats, could be shoes, could be fueling, protein, whatever it happens to be. And what I would encourage people to look at and really do some analysis on this is, and these are private companies, so they care about ROI and they care about marketing ROI. Right now, a disproportionate amount of financial money is going into the eyeballs in traditional media, which are not actually the people playing the sports. Millions and millions and tens and hundreds of millions of dollars are being paid for adults that aren't playing the sports to see brands on television and online. And I think that if somebody came up with a good equation that said, but how much more valuable 100x, 500x, 1000x is it for an athlete that is participating with my brand? That math, I think, will work if you've got a long point of view. And all of a sudden, the 8 million participants in youth sports that have no media value become a lot more interesting from a brand ROI perspective. So that's where I would start on the private side.
Perfect. Yeah, we've thought a lot about this at the Aspen Institute, and I think about, some of the outdoor brands that have come together 1% for climate change, and I think, well, if we had any of these brands doing 1%, wow, we would have a lot of money for youth sports. So Jared, thinking about more on the grassroots level and accessibility and affordability, I just want to kick it to you for our last question. How can financial innovations and policy innovations intersect to really level the playing field? And what are you guys doing at Fun Play to push this forward?
Yeah, there are so many different aspects of youth sports policy that are worth being focused on, and that's not even to speak to the things that Stephen and Brent and Binta had brought up at the college level and elsewhere. There's definitely a need to increase funding to programs to build and refurbish play spaces to keep them safe and playable and local. I mentioned the need for better child safeguarding policies and coach training. And one of the questions that often comes up is how can organizations that are running free or low-cost programs afford to provide all of these things? And what is the funding mechanism by which they can be supported? One of the things Brent mentioned is the types of organizations, equipment, apparel, et cetera. There's so many different organizations that are coming together to work with Fun Play, the Under Armours and Nikes of the world, and on the technology side, League Apps and TeamSnap, who are competitors but come together to fund youth sports access and participation and players' health, and anchored on the child safeguarding and background check side of things. And all of this ties to some of the policy work and advocacy that we're doing. One of the answers, and the one that we're feeling really strong about, and motivated to go after, I think has been in front of us since 2018, when the Supreme Court gave the states the go-ahead to legalize sports betting. And Tom Farrey has been kind of carrying the torch for this since that point, and wrote this kind of seminal post, and has followed up in op-eds and other articles about using and the opportunity to use tax revenue from sports betting to fund youth sports to increase access and participation. And there's lots of valid feelings and thoughts about sports betting, but it is here. And it is bringing in tremendous amounts of tax revenue at the state and federal level. The 38 states and DC and Puerto Rico have legalized sports betting. We've worked to advocate for sports betting funding for youth sports grant programs in several of those states. Starting in New York this year, $12.5 million of sports betting tax revenue will go to youth sports grant funds run through the state. Connecticut, DC, North Carolina, Massachusetts are among others that allocate a portion of sports betting tax revenue to youth sports grants as well. And federally, there is a pool of funding called the Federal Sports Gaming Excise Tax, which last year was $370 million, projected to grow over $400 million when the 2025 receipts are finalized. And this is unappropriated, unallocated funding. And there's precedent for excise taxes being used for positive purposes. You think about an oil and gas excise tax that pays for the highway trust fund to rebuild and to refurbish and renovate the highway system. There's an airline excise tax that pays to refurbish and renovate airports. So we believe that there's an opportunity through legislation to utilize funds from the federal sports gaming excise tax to support youth sports organizations, play spaces, background checks, coach training, even implement the presidential fitness test that was recently brought back by executive order, and still be able to use some of those funds to support efforts to combat problem gaming, which is legitimate and is a problem for sure as well. So that's one of the ways that we're thinking about it. Can we find existing pools of funding like the federal sports gaming excise tax and utilize that for good to increase access and participation in youth sports?
Great, Jared. Thank you so much for that. If I could have Tom and Dion come back on, there's a question or two from the audience I would love to ask, and I think you all have done a lot of research in this area, but feel free, anyone who wants to answer. We're seeing state legislation come through in California and Illinois, like the Sports for All Act that just passed and was signed by Governor Newsom in California, to try to drive policy or create sport coalitions. What are the obstacles to creating a federal sports agency? Would it be possible to have one to kind of regulate national sports policy, or do we need to look at states as models for really driving this to begin with?
Tom, do you want to take that, or do you want me to respond?
Why don't you jump in? You're better.
Yeah. Well, Ashley, I think, first of all, I think we need to think about this. We have a shared power between our federal government and the states. The states are traditionally entrusted with keeping citizens safe. So if you look at this from sort of a constitutional law perspective, you would say states should be taking the lead. On the other hand, what youth sports and what we know about youth sports is that it crosses state boundaries. It's so important to the entire sports ecosystem that, of course, the federal government also has power to regulate in this area. So I think both need to be getting into the policy conversations. And I've heard a lot in this discussion about sports as a public good, or Olympic and Paralympic sports are public goods. That's absolutely the case. And I remember when I first started out in sports law, there's a famous Supreme Court case about the Olympic rings. And in dissent, Justice Marshall talks about this is a public good. And we found with the Olympic Commission, the American public wants elite athletes, and we want winners. We want this pipeline. We want grassroots sports. We need to pay for it. And so, what are the obstacles to a federal agency? Well, I'll tell you that after our Olympic Commission report dropped, we delivered it to all members of Congress. It had a very modest proposal for just an office in the Department of Health and Human Services that would coordinate grant funding and maybe manage, say, background checks for kids' sports. And immediately, Senator Cruz said, this crazy commission wants to micromanage T-ball leagues. I think we need to get beyond that kind of stuff and realize that we can do a lot of good to make sports safe for kids. We can fund it. I think the obstacles are, of course, political as we are downsizing and closing down government agencies. I don't see it being a winner to start a new one. But this is what states are for, Ashley. I mean, they are laboratories. And I think as states have realized that they have the power and a great incentive to be involved in the sports space, I think we've seen a lot of good things come from that. And I think while we're waiting for the federal government to sort this out, whatever our administrative state is going to be, I think we should be using our states as laboratories and get some good solutions going.
Yeah, I think it's I would just add very briefly, it's just a little shift, and nobody wants an overregulated environment. I mean, the private sector is rising. It can solve problems quickly. No one wants to get in the way there. But we need to make this little shift toward what is governance. And good governance really is just about a balancing of competing interests, right? We have lots of interests in this space. We have no tables for those interests to come together and share ideas and solve problems together, other than non-government spaces like the Aspen Institute. But other countries do have such a mechanism. There's, Sport England, there's Sport Australia. These are not always heavily, straight out of the federal government running everything. They're just entities that have a 6-year plan and they have a relationship with the key actors in the space. So I think it's just moving beyond this idea that any regulation is bad regulation, and just start thinking about it in terms of through the frame of the balancing of competing interests.
Wonderful. One quick question, if we can answer it as like a lightning round, because Tom, you got to close us out. The question is, we have World Cup 26 coming, LA 28. We have a golden decade, right? We have 10 mega events in 10 years. Are these going to be catalysts for change or just missed opportunities waiting to happen? Quick thoughts.
Ashley, I'll start. I will say this is the time. I think it could be a real catalyst for change, but I think we all have to realize we need to make that happen. We need to use our voices.
I'm an optimist, so I'm going to go with absolutely. We have conversations like this. The 500 people on this call have the expertise to really bring that change to Washington. The good thing we have going for us is sports are in the spotlight. We're talking about it on Capitol Hill with college sports. President Trump, half of his public appearances have been at sporting events. So there is a real desire to get sports right. It's the expertise that everyone on this call is bringing, everyone in the audience. It just needs to make its way to Washington. You don't get a seat at the table by luck or by hope. It's by engaging here. And as so long as we keep that up, yes, these will be catalysts for change.
I think about the LA84 Foundation, formed as a legacy of the 1984 Olympics, and how they continue to support youth sports in Southern California 40 years later at such an amazing level. And so there is the opportunity, as you've pointed out, and what we need to do is come together with a coordinated effort to state that there needs to be a legacy of the World Cup in each location of the LA 28 games, and that it takes educating lawmakers and decision makers and key champions about why it's so important that youth sports be funded to take advantage of it. So to Stephen's point, it's and to Dion, like, it's going to just take us coming together to do it, and no one's going to be doing it for us.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think you have two generational opportunities coming together. One is obviously all of these events on American soil coming up, which is great. And the other is, as Stephen said, I mean, college sports is changing more in a year than it does in a decade right now. 5 decades, a generation is happening over the next couple of years. I actually think it's those two things together that create the opportunity. And I sure hope that we find ways through that to really encourage more participation in youth sports broadly, take the pressure off the youth sports ecosystem a little bit. And obviously you've heard my spiel here. I think one of the tactical ways to do that is I think we should have 1 million athletes playing serious sports in college. I think it is very, very doable.
I agree with the rest of the panel. I think we've got lightning in the bottle. I think we're at an incredible moment in time. And I'll go back to what I was saying previously, which is that sports still feels like the place where we can all come together and agree, regardless of where we're coming from. It's something that we all enjoy. More and more people are discovering it. College sports is taking off. Women's sports continues to take off. The ceiling is still high for some of the more mature leagues. And so as everybody comes in and continues to celebrate this great thing that we have, I think it's an extraordinary opportunity. And I'm deeply optimistic that we'll be able to come together and do something good.
Thank you so much. Tom, I'll kick it to you. Thank you so much to the panelists. You want to close us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you to everyone. Look, my big takeaway here is if we start with an idea of what we want our sport ecosystem to produce, a healthier society, a more competitive society, et cetera, and we work back from there, we're going to develop good policy. So thank you all for forming a really terrific conversation. We have a replay. If you want to watch this again and again and again, There you go. There's the URL. Enjoy it. Please, Dion's book. Highly recommend it. Give it a read. We have sports policy and governance resources as well, an array at the national, down to the local, college, at every level on our Project Play website. So please check that out. And then finally, the Project Play Summit. We just recently announced that our signature event will be May 5th and 6th in Boston, great city of Boston, the champion city. And so keep an eye out. You can register pretty soon here. And then finally, subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn and other socials where we will continue this conversation. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you, Ash, for leading a great conversation. And we'll see you next time.